I know that I mentioned this on my last video, but I just wanted to reiterate, we recently passed 20,000 subscribers on my channel. I simply cannot believe that I have 20,000 followers, 20,000 subscribers. I want to thank you all so much, each and every one of you who made the decision to subscribe after you watch one of my videos. I truly and greatly appreciate it. Now, I recently had the great fortune of being able to go back to Nashville, Tennessee. I've been here a few times before. I wanted to do some more famous grave visits and do some revisits to those I wanted to do perhaps a little better job of telling the story. And does it get any more country than George Jones? And I mean, just an impressive resume list of accomplishments. Today, we're going to take a look at the life and visit the grave of the possum, George Jones. Today we are in Woodlawn Memorial Park in Nashville, Tennessee. As we walk up, there's no doubt that we are coming up on the grave of a country music icon. George Jones was born September 12, 1931 in Saratoga, Texas. It can be said that George came from a musical family, with his father playing the harmonica and guitar and his mother playing the piano in church on Sundays. His parents purchased a radio, and George heard country music for the first time at the age of 7. He would lie in his bed on Saturday nights and listen to the Grand Ole Opry. Unfortunately, George's father could become quite abusive when alcohol was involved. It was said that his father would come home intoxicated in the middle of the night, wake young George up, and force him to sing. While one would think that this would turn him away from singing, the opposite would actually happen. His father would purchase him a guitar, and he would learn to play chords and sing in church. George left home at age 16, moving to Jasper, Texas, and performing on KTXJ radio. He worked at KRIC and was able to meet his idol, Hank Williams. He was the hero of young George Jones. Jones would enlist in the United States Marines, with his service ending in 1953. His first record, entitled No Money in This Deal, was recorded in 1954. It was during this time that he was nicknamed the Possum. He would sing and record for the next several years and even did a few shows with Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash. In 1959, he would start to achieve commercial breakout success. It was during this time that he would achieve his first #1 song, White Lightning. Jones would later admit that he showed up to record the song under the influence, and it took him about 80 takes to get the recording right. Jones would continue to release songs, but started developing a reputation for not showing up at shows, or when he did show up, being intoxicated. This earned him another not so flattering nickname, No Show Jones. Upon signing with United Artists in 1962, he scored one of his biggest career hits of all time, She Thinks I Still Care. In 1967, Jones had to seek treatment for his drinking. His wife at the time would hide the keys to all of his vehicles to prevent him from driving. She, however, forgot to hide the keys to the lawnmower. He would go on to drive the mower to the liquor store, in which he would comically make fun of in later years. Jones first became familiar with fellow artist Tammy Wynette in the 1960s when their tours were booked through the same agency. Wynette was married to Don Chappell, who performed an opening act for her show. Jones was a dinner guest at their home one evening when Wynette and Chappell got into a heated argument. Chappell would call Wynette an expletive. When Jones heard this, he jumped up from his chair and flipped the table over in anger. Apparently, Jones proclaimed his love for Tammy Wynette during this episode. They would marry in 1969. The two superstars would begin touring together and would become known as Mr. and Mrs. Country Music. George's addictions would begin to take a downturn. In 1970, he was straitjacketed and committed to a padded cell in Florida after a drunken episode. His erratic behavior would contribute to their divorce in 1976. In the late 1970s, things began spiraling further out of control. He began using other substances and would at times find himself penniless. The rate in which he missed shows would become even higher, and lawsuits and back child support pushed him to the point of filing bankruptcy. After all of the trials and issues that he faced in his life, redemption finally came. When 1980 came around, it had been 6 years since he had a #1 song. His song, "He Stopped Loving Her Today," shocked the country music industry when it went to #1 and stayed there for 18 weeks. Although Jones initially didn't like the song, he would later say that a 4-decade career had been salvaged by a 3-minute song. The song would earn him a Grammy Award for Best Male Country Performance, ACM Single of the Year and Song of the Year, and it won the CMA Award for Best Song in both 1980 and 1981. With a return to success came a new recording contract and a special on HBO. He would still have a few run-ins with the law and still drank, however, his commercial success continued. He had several more hits and another #1 song in 1984. In 1981, he met one of his saving graces, Nancy. She helped him with finances and managing his career, kept him away from the drug dealers, and Jones gave her complete credit for saving his life. He would marry her in 1983 and remain with her for the rest of his life. He would release a few more albums into the 90s, including the song "I Don't Need Your Rockin' Chair," which was a tribute to his spunk into his advancing years. George Jones was rushed to the hospital in April 2013 with a fever and irregular blood pressure. After 6 days in intensive care, he passed away at age 81. His funeral was held at the Grand Ole Opry Building. In attendance was former First Lady Laura Bush, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam, Mike Huckabee, along with a host of artists including Alan Jackson, Vince Gill, Patty Loveless, Travis Tritt, the Oak Ridge Boys, and Charlie Daniels. George Jones was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1992. After Jones's death, "He Stopped Loving Her Today" once again made the country charts. You know, the past few videos that I have done that have been about these country music artists, I have actually went back and listened to some of their old songs and watched some of their old interviews, and it really helps put me into the perspective of where they were at the time in their careers and what they were thinking, and you know, the best you can by watching that kind of stuff. But it is an honor to visit the grave of George Jones, and I mean, George Jones is simply a country music legend, and I'm so glad to be able to pay my respects to him. As mentioned before, I have visited his grave before, but didn't really do a tribute to him, which is something that I really like to do on my channel. And this is another situation where there were ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. It seems like it was a kind of a cycle for George, but I'm so glad that that redemption finally came, and he seemed to be in a good place towards the latter part of his life, and meeting Nancy really seemed to, you know, advance that. So, so glad to be able to find, you know, those people who have gone through hard times but have redemption stories. So once again, I'm so glad to be able to visit his grave at Woodlawn Cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee. And you know, for someone with the resume of George Jones, I mean, where do you start and where do you finish? Yeah, I tried to do the best that I could to highlight some of his accomplishments and his career, but there is just so many things that I could have mentioned. Nearly impossible to get all of that on the video, but we are honored once again to be in Nashville, Tennessee at the Woodlawn Cemetery. Beautiful place, beautiful area, full of history, and that includes the great George Jones. If you haven't subscribed, I ask that you please click the subscribe button. When you click on that, there's a little bell that's going to be right beside of it. Click on that too. All that does is let you know when I release a new video. It's all totally free, so thank you all for joining. I am going to leave links in the description where you can find me. Facebook, Instagram, my merchandise. I really and truly appreciate it. And once again, From Woodlawn Cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee, I will see you again soon.